All right. So we are back for round two. I'm glad to see you all back. We're going to talk through, I have the flat version of the expectations for this week that I will send out to everybody after this class, or better said, Brittany probably will. Let me share my screen and we will get going. And by the way, I'm going to be doing this a lot. That's because right now there's NFL football happening. So we just got to make sure that we keep our priorities straight about the Eagles losing, if at all possible. So if praying is your thing, I'd appreciate it. And I'm sorry for you Rams fans. I guess the SoCal people probably a little upset about last night, but that's the way the cookie crumbles, I guess. So, can everybody see my screen? All right. So here's the deal for this week. You guys all did the before lecture stuff. I trust. I did not yet take a look at the big study guide questions. I was focused pretty significantly on the assignments from Saturday, and we're going to talk about that in detail in a minute. But as you can see in the Monday lecture, this week we're going to be focused on basically half the class, maybe even a little more. We're going to be doing the data manipulation exercise and vignettes review because I want to spend some significant time there. And then the back half, we're going to talk about the HR life cycle and HR data technology stack. I hope you guys watched Ben and I have our vaudeville time going back and forth and nerding out a little bit about HR and the life cycle and how the tech stack happens there. I've got some slides to walk us all through to talk about that because that's really the foundation of where and how HR practitioners do what they do, organizational research or otherwise. And so it's an important thing for us to get through before we continue down the road towards the more technical stuff. After that and before lab, we're going to be handing off and you're going to stop hearing from me so darn much. And Dr. Ben's going to take over. And for the next few weeks, he's really going to be the primary instructor. And I'm going to be behind the scenes helping out with some of the materials and the exercises and the data that y'all are going to be working with to do your assignments as we get closer and closer to that project. Most of the things you see, the reading and the watching and the assessments are stuff of Ben's design. And then tomorrow's lab will be driven by Dr. Ben and some slides that he's got ready for y'all on tap. Ben, anything else before we get into the nitty gritty?
Nope, nothing else for me.
All right, sweet. So first things first, we are going to talk about the data manipulation exercise and the vignettes. I'm going to be honest with you guys, the data manipulation exercise did not go super well. Chelsea's there laughing. She's like, yeah, I know, I get it. We had some struggles there. I think some folks had some computer challenges. I sent out an email about that. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys to deal with computers that couldn't quite keep up. I think we had some challenges in general with the bases of how data talk to each other. So we're gonna do something kind of important. We're going to say another bite at the apple. But before I do that, I'm big on recognition, and I want to call out both Julie and Marina. Your guys' data manipulation exercises were exceptional. They were quite good, and so I don't know how close y'all are, but if you know what Julie's cell phone number is, shoot her a text because she really rocked it. But I think the rest of us have some growth to do there, and so we're gonna dial back. I'm literally gonna do the exercise with you guys live today with screen share. And then you're going to do the exercise again. And so this Saturday, you're going to resubmit this exercise. And I'm going to kind of like dual grade. So what you did last week is going to count, but what you do this week is going to count more. And so between the experience you had, the walkthrough today, and then the extra time to work on it, hopefully y'all can move that a little bit closer to where it needs to be. Manipulating data is a really big deal in organizational research, and so we're gonna do that. So what you can see, in order to do that, what Dr. Bennett and I decided is that we're going to extend the writing assignment an additional week. So instead of the paper being due this Saturday, the paper will be due next Saturday, and your second version of the data manipulation is going to be due this Saturday. Does that track for everybody?
And real quick, Chris, Marina is in the waiting room. If you could let her in real
Oh,
quick. Yeah.
she missed her shout out. You
She
guys are
missed
gonna
the
have to tell
shout
her
out.
all right.
Thank you, Mariah.
All right. I think we got the whole crew now. So we were just talking about, for those that just joined us, that the data manipulation exercise didn't go super well, with the exception of Julie and Marina, who rocked it. I think we got some growth to do there. So today we're going to go through and walk through it, and we're going to take another bite at it. So y'all are going to resubmit this exercise on Saturday. And then your writing assignment is going to be due a week later. Now they're all going to be in the same place in Canvas. So it's the writing assignment is due in week 3, but it's still going to be in your week 2 module. So it's going to be the same place. You're just gonna submit it later. Does that track for everybody? All right. So I was looking desperately for
one other quick thing, Chris, just in terms of level setting on kind of making sure that your expectations are similar to ours. So the other small little exercise that you all do for every week is basically to reflect on how pick a question in the discussion, right? In the discussion, pick a question that your answer changed the most for. And so as I was reviewing those today, and most of you did a great job. There was a couple of some situations where it was pretty clear that some folks just copied and pasted stuff straight from the book and just put in the flat definition of deductive or inductive reasoning. That's not really what we're looking for. We're not going to make that a big thing, but just moving forward, we'd really like to treat that discussion like a discussion. And so reflect on how, answer that way. My answer has changed here because of, we really want it to be discussion based. I think somebody even threw a question in there, a follow-up question that they want to build on. That's perfect. So make it conversational, make it reflective of your knowledge and how your knowledge has shifted. We know what those mean. You don't need to paste in the definition, but reflect on, we want to see that you're really thinking about it. And we want to see how your thinking has evolved. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of feedback there, since that was the first one we did. So I guess any questions on that? Any clarifications on the discussion questions? Okay, sorry about that, Chris. I just thought about it when we were giving feedback.
No, it's perfect. And I want to add 2 cents to this, right? Like there are a lot of theoretical courses you're going to do where you're learning essentially declarative knowledge, right? About theories and effects and ways that the mind and groups work, right? That's a big part of learning to be an applied psychologist. This class is really about challenging how you think and helping you think in more creative ways. That's how you become an effective researcher, right? So there will be declarative knowledge that you need to gain. There will be skills that we're trying to hone. You're going to learn new vocabulary words and what they mean. But that's going to be reflected in the writing assignments and in the discussion boards and in your presentation, because that's going to show us that you're applying those skills in a way that's moving the way that you think about problems, right? And that's what makes an exceptional researcher, somebody who can think differently. And that's going to be a competitive advantage for you when you go off and launch your career as an IO or other applied practitioner. So thank you for bringing that up, Ben. Okay. So we're going to walk through this assignment. I did it today just to make sure that I wasn't missing anything crazy. But we're going to go through each of these things. I'm not going to pause really fast because it's probably going to take 20-30 minutes to go through it piece by piece here. But it's all going to be recorded. You're going to be able to go back to it. And when you do your second round, you're going to be good. Everybody can still see my screen? Cool. All right, sweet. Here we go. So you guys actually mostly nailed these 2. So the create a first name and last name field, create a manager name for each field. That one is I don't know if it was gimme or not, but most of y'all were able to handle this pretty well. So I'm actually not even going to waste time going through it. But if you haven't done it, essentially going through, and can I move this? I'm not going to be able to move that. Okay. We may have to move this down a little bit. Sorry, my Zoom header is bugging my ability to click on things in Excel. Okay. Essentially, the text to columns function, I'm going to talk about very fast, but essentially there's 2 major ways to delimit columns here. When it's delimited, what you're saying is I want to use some kind of character to identify what moves, right? In this case, a comma. If you noticed when you did this, there were a couple folks that had multiple commas in their names, and that would trash or overwrite columns. And if you notice that, you may have had to go backwards and fix that. So delimiting is typically if you know there's something that you can use reliably to split, you can do that. The other way to parse columns in Excel is with fixed width, where you can say some amount of characters stay here And after that number of characters, it moves. So I want the three leftmost characters here and then everything else over there. You guys seem to do this reasonably well. The other direction, concatenation, is a really helpful thing for lots of reasons. You can use it here if you're trying to put a name together, but you can also use it to create a primary key. So you might not have, for example, a total record primary key like an employee ID, but maybe you have an email address and an application date. And if you put those two things together, then you know it's a reliably unique thing. So concatenation is useful for a ton of reasons. You guys did a pretty decent job on it. The only piece of feedback I would give you is that make sure you're delimiting something in between the values that you're putting together so you can break it apart again in the future. So some of you put younger J together, but you didn't put a comma in between. So it was just younger J as opposed to younger comma J. So make sure that you're keeping delimiters in there where you can in your concatenations, because then when you want to break it out, and I guarantee you will, you'll have something so it's easy to go backwards. Rebecca, question?
Does a space count as a delimiter?
A space is technically a delimiter. It's not typically a very reliable delimiter though, because spaces tend to show up in lots of alpha strings. So you could use a space. I tend to like to use something uncommon like a pipe, which is if you look at your keyboard, it kind of looks like this, right? That's one that's really good. A dash, a semicolon, an underscore, things that pick something that isn't going to show up in the data except for where you put it. Things like commas and dashes and things like that oftentimes are present in other places and they're not really good to use. But technically, yes, any character can be a delimiter. All right, so we'll skip these two. Like I said, we won't actually do them. So this is where most of us really got tripped up, which is importing location information and using, some of you figured out that it was VLOOKUP, but it didn't really go super well. Some of you used a sort. So that was technically a way to do it, where if you sorted both sets of data properly with the same primary key, you could just copy and paste. That is technically a way to do it, and it did technically work, but it isn't reliable in that it's not matching primary keys and ensuring that it's correct, right? And so unless you can reliably know that you have a one-to-one match between your data sets, that's not going to work every time. So we're going to go through and see how we do VLOOKUPs to import these locations. So we needed to move location, cost center, and job information. So we'll start with location information. So we know we have employee ID here, which is our primary key. And if you didn't watch the primary key video, please go back and watch it tip to tail. The idea of a primary key is it's the social security number for your record. It's the thing that makes your record unique, and it connects across lots of different data sets. So if you have a roster and learning data or any kind of data, an employee ID is great. In talent acquisition data, it's often a requisition ID or an email address, but it's something that's unique to the candidate or the job or the employee, and it's unique and it's always unique. And that's really important. So in this case, we know that we have our employee ID in both places, roster and location. So the first thing you do when you do this is you say, okay, well, what am I bringing over? I'm bringing over these three fields, the geo, the frontliner corp, and the location. So in this case, I'm going to drop these three in here. One of the things I like to do, this is more of a style preference. Anytime I'm adding data to data that isn't necessarily mine, I like to make the header a different color. This is just a best practice for you to say, okay, well, if somebody asks me or I go backwards or I come back to this in 6 weeks, I know that these are things that I added. They didn't just come out of the system that way. But again, that's more of a preference thing for me. So VLOOKUP, right? The first argument in the VLOOKUP is the value. What are we VLOOKing up, right? The next thing is what table are we looking it up in, right? Now what you can do here is you can either grab all the columns if you want to do the whole column, or you can do a table range, which I'll do here because it'll allow us to do some other stuff later. And then the next argument is which column am I bringing back from that table, right? So in this case, it's going to be number 2, but then we're also going to add 3 and 4 in a minute, and I'll show that to you. And then the last thing is, do we want an exact match or an approximate match? You almost always, I don't think I've ever used true here. I've always used exact. Now, that'll bring back the geo for this employee ID. Now, we need to do a couple things before we start dragging this. The first thing we got to do is we have to lock our ranges. And that's what dollar signs are for. What dollar signs do is they basically say, as I drag this formula, I don't want this A to change. I don't want this 1 to change. I don't want this D to change. And I don't want this 119, 146 to change. Now there's another thing we have to lock here. We have to lock what we're looking up. We have to lock the employee ID. So in this case, I don't want the A to change, but I do want the 2 to change because as I drag it down, I want it to look at new employee IDs. And so I want to lock the A, but not the 2, and that's why there's only $1 sign here. Now, as I drag this over to these 2, we're going to see we get AP, JC again, right? And why is that? It's because we're still calling column number 2. But now, in this table, we want column number 3, and in this table, we want column number 4, right? And so now I've called these 3 fields from the location table that I've mapped to, and now I'm going to double click this. And this is going to be a place where the computer might struggle a little. In fact, it's probably going to take about 60 seconds or so. And what's going to happen in Excel is you'll see down here, it's starting to calculate. Now, if you go start clicking on things while this happens, it's going to crash your Excel. But if you leave it alone and you just let it do its thing, it's going to take a minute, but typically it'll be able to catch up because it's going to get to 100% and then it's going to calculate and then it's going to drop it. So I'm going to pause here. Thoughts, questions, comments? My gosh, you went super fast. That's okay. You can come back and watch this later. I think Mallory, you have a hand up. Stuart, you have a hand up. Let's go with Mallory and then Stuart.
Yeah, so for that one, I did the concatenate and joined all 3 of those categories together and like separated them and then just did it in one. Is that allowed or is that not correct either? Like, can you do that?
You could do that, but what then you've created is you've kind of created a string, and I noticed that in your file.
Yeah.
You kind of created a string that didn't really mean anything, right? Because now you've taken 3 pieces of data and you've made it 1 piece of data. There might be a moment where you want to do that. But typically it's better to keep data as deaggregated as you can. That's a general rule of thumb.
Okay.
If you have to aggregate it for some reason, you can. But it's not really going to save you a lot of like performance time, so to speak.
Okay. I just didn't know because I didn't know if it was just like the location because it was like the city, state, and then whatever, and if you could combine that for it all to make sense. But yeah, I didn't.
Yep.
Cool.
That's fair. Stuart.
My question is more of a future one, but I have it on the top of my head because it involves the VLOOKUP. So I was doing the VLOOKUP, and for some reason, it was, I think, for the 5th part. And for some reason, when I brought it back to the original roster, the VLOOKUP code was stuck on Aries, whatever the first person name is, the last name. The VLOOKUP got stuck, and when I would press enter, it wouldn't do anything, but it was just stuck on that one. But everything else was fine. But when I just that VLOOKUP got stuck in that specific name, do you know why that would be?
Yeah, so sometimes what happens is that it's almost like the cell doesn't refresh. So when you refresh the formulas or you copy and paste as values, it will typically refresh it. That does happen sometimes. It's really just more of like a performance, like a display issue more than anything else. So we've got these here. Now, the first thing that we want to do when we get to something like this, there's a couple things to do here. One is you want to document the formula that you used. This is something that as you get better and better, you may not need to do this as much. Like I wouldn't do this for a VLOOKUP, but for a more complicated formula, I might. But you can add a comment here, put in the formula, and now when you go and you erase these formulas, which I'm about to do for performance sake, and if you read the email I sent over the weekend, I think it was, you'll understand why. But essentially now, if I ever want to go back and say, oh, what formula did I use to create this? I've kind of documented it here. And it's a nice little cheat sheet for you to keep track, especially if you're building something with lots of columns and lots of different calculated fields. It's just a quick, easy way for you to document what you did. But now we've got these 3 versions in here. Now, I'm not going to do the cost center because it's essentially the same thing that we just did. We're going to do job information next. And the reason I want to do job information is what's different about job information when compared with the location information and the cost center information.
You can't use the employee ID as the primary key.
That's right. That's exactly right. Now, we can't use it because the employee ID isn't there. But what is the primary key in this case?
Job code.
Exactly. Job code. Now, when we go to use job code in this case, now our formula is going to look a little bit different. So when I go to job information here, and I say I'm going to bring these over, the job family through the job grade, and I go back into my roster and I paste these in, and I make it yellow because I'm messing around with stuff. I'm going to say VLOOKUP but I'm not going to go over to the employee ID this time. Now I'm going to go over to the job code because that's the primary key in this instance for what we're trying to do. Now, in this case, it's not really a one-to-one employee ID table to other. What we're dealing with here is what's sometimes called a mapping table, where if we go over and we look at the job code information, there's only, 200 or, oh, sorry, this is one thing I wanted to show here. So let's forget this for a second. One of the things you can do here, which will make the computer processing easier, is we can say how many job codes there are really. There's not 19,000 different job codes, right? You can see that there's duplicates here, 1264, 12646. So in this case, one of the things that you could have done, it wasn't required, but would have made your life easier, is make sure you have all these clicked and you can remove duplicates. This is one of the other videos you needed to watch. And what we found is that there's only 285 unique job codes across this whole data set. But now what I've done is I've made this VLOOKUP a lot easier. So when I go grab my job code here and I come over to my job information table, now I'm only grabbing 285 rows. And so why does that matter? That matters because, oh, sorry, folks, I'm going too fast here. I forgot my job code argument. So in case that was confusing to any of you, we have the actual argument in here first, and now we move to the table array that we want. And now we're saying we want to bring in number 2 and false, right? So you guys are all with me there that now we have the job family loaded up. Now, same thing we did before. We're going to lock our table and we're going to lock the O, but not the 2. But now because we're only looking at 286 rows instead of 19,000 rows or 100,000 rows in the case of the previous look, when I bring this over and I change this to number 3, number 4, and number 5, watch how much faster this goes. Now, we're not trying to learn to be database engineers here, but everybody notice how much faster that went? Because I wasn't asking it to table scan 100,000 rows every time. Sometimes you need to do that, right? Like in the first example. But anytime you can take an opportunity to reduce the amount of work your computer needs to do, it's going to make your life a whole heck of a lot easier. And that's why across these 100,000 people, we were able to do essentially the same amount of mapping in a fraction of the time because we were only looking at 200 rows instead of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of rows. Thoughts, comments, questions?
How did you establish which to give the absolute, the $?
How did I start? I'm sorry, ask me again.
How did you establish, like, I know in the video they had talked about like making the absolute for your table, but how did you know to do the O but not the 2 for
Oh, gotcha. So when you're looking at let me undo the, okay. So essentially think about the logic of the formula as it's set up, right? So O is the column and 2 is the row. Just like A is the column, 1 is the row, E is the column, 286 is the row. You got to decide what you want to move when you drag the formula. So when I drag this formula that's in this cell, S2, to the right, I don't want that O to change because I want it to keep looking at the job code. But when I drag the formula down, I do want the 2 to change because I want it to go down to the next row. So in that instance, I want the O locked, but not the 2, right? And when I'm looking at the table that I'm referencing, I want it all locked because I want it to be looking at the same time. And look, I still make this mistake sometimes and I'll drag and I'll get a bunch of NAs and I'll be like, oh crap, I forgot to lock my range. And so it was good for a few rows, but my table was getting lower as my formula was getting lower. Does that answer your question?
Yes, can you move your mouse though for a second? I just want to look at it for a little more. Okay. Yeah, so essentially that's the reason why I wasn't able to autofill the entire column because I didn't put the O with the absolute.
Yep.
Okay.
It's a common mistake. Dollar signs are your absolute best friend when you're trying to kind of scale formulas and move them. And now that I'm saying that I'm not going to do the comp or the cost center data, I am actually going to do that because we need it for the other exercises. So we're going to go to cost center We're going to bring cost center in over here. And we're going to real quick home. We're going to go all the way over. We're going to go back to cost center by employee. I know I'm not voicing this over, but we just did this, so I'm just going quickly for the sake of time. And if you're not going to drag it, you don't technically need to lock that A, but. So now this is going to take a minute. It's got a process, but now it'll go a little faster than the other one because we're only doing one. So VLOOKUPs, they're your best friend. And if you don't understand the concept of primary keys and how they work, and to Tyler's point, the idea of locking formulas, it's going to be rough. So rewatch those VLOOKUP videos, make $signs your best friend, rewatch this. It'll be super, super helpful. Thoughts or questions since we have a minute while the computer catches up? All right. So when we got past this section in the assignment and we moved down to basically what needed to be pivot tables, right? And or remove of duplicates. This was about 50-50. About half of you kind of got it and about half of you didn't. But we're going to talk through.
Real quick, Chris, there was one other question I think got on the side chat. Real quick, I'm just going to read it verbatim. Does it automatically do the absolute, or is this something we have to add?
Meaning the $signs?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, $signs don't get auto added when you select something. It's not an exception necessarily, but one exception is if you choose an entire column, you're not going to get a number. You're just going to get the column. And so you don't have to lock that, obviously, if you're looking at an entire column. So how many unique managers are there? So the easiest way to answer this one is to essentially pivot based on the direct manager name that we have here. So actually now we don't technically need that because we have the manager EEID. So we're just going to skip that part and we will pivot this. So I'm going to grab this whole table. That's one way to do it. You could also just grab the columns if you want. Insert pivot table. We're going to put it in a new worksheet. And now we have manager login or manager EEID. And what this is going to do in a pivot table is essentially create one row per unique individual value in this column. So there are 19,000, no, is it 19,000? 19,100? No, it's more than that. It's 191, I think, right? That's better, yeah. 119. Sorry, I can't have this maximized otherwise I can't see the top. So 119,000 people, employees in this data set. There's some number less than that of people managing those people. And so when you pivot, the data term for this is cross tabulation. Excel calls it a pivot table, but technically it's called a cross tabulation. This is going to give us one row per unique value in whatever we put in the row. In this case, manager employee ID. And so this starts in row 2. If I go down here and I see 7,163, or 7,162, it's actually one less than that. So we have 7,161 unique managers in this data set. Rebecca, question.
The approach that I took to this was remove duplicates in the manager, the concatenated manager name column. And so, but the argument for a pivot table, would you choose that over remove duplicates because it's more accurate knowing that there's a unique manager ID, and perhaps if you remove duplicates in the manager names, it could miss something? I'm just trying to understand why you choose a pivot table over.
So the reason I choose a pivot table is because I'm going to do more with a pivot table than I'm going to do with remove duplicates, right? If I was trying to create a list to send to somebody, to your point, a pivot table probably wouldn't be that great. But the other way to do this, to Rebecca's point, if y'all aren't following, it's a perfectly legitimate way to do this. We can take manager or employee ID, we can copy it, we can bring it back over here to where we're playing around with these data, and we can paste it. And what we're going to have is we're going to have the 119,000. But then if we take this column and we go to data and we remove duplicates, and we say there's only one column here, right? It's going to say 7,162 unique values remain. And so that is another legitimate way to do what we're talking about. So if you all are following, same number of unique values. Oh, actually, it kept manager ID. So it's actually one less than that because it counted the column header as one. Bailey.
Sorry, you went kind of quick. So you just copied and paste. You did a pivot table on that whole first roster sheet, and then
yeah, there's two ways to do this. The first thing was the pivot table, where we know it's going to bring back one unique value per, and then Becca's comment made a ton of sense, which is, well, I could also just look at the data, right, and then remove the duplicates and do the count that way.
yeah, but to begin with, you just took the entire roster page, made a pivot table out of it, and then
Correct.
Okay, and then did it sorry, I don't know if you had clicked something, but when you created that with them and you clicked the manager employee ID, did it automatically eliminate duplicates and make only the unique values?
In the pivot table?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the point of a pivot table, or the rows of a pivot table, is to bring back one unique value per value in that particular field. So it went to manager ID. When I put that in rows, it says, oh, okay, I know you're going to cross tab this because I might add something like employee ID, right? So if I want to know, for example, how many employees each of these managers have, right, from largest to smallest, I can now see that because it's only going to bring back one record for 112,355,822, whoever that is. And they have 296 rows in these data. I do have to move on because we got to move to other stuff, but the pivot table videos will be super helpful if that's still confusing.
Where's the sort feature? Because like I wasn't able to sort. Like I was able to get the pivot, but not the sort.
We'll come back to sort, but
okay.
How many employees are in the three biggest cost centers? So we have a pivot table here already, and so we're going to get rid of manager ID here, but trust that we're pivoting again, and we're going to bring in cost center, and now we have one record per cost center, right? So now you could use basically any value here, but the important part of this here is the idea that this says count, not sum. That was a mistake that some of y'all made. You took a continuous number and it summed it instead of counted it, and that messed around with your arithmetic. So here we have a count, and if you right click, Tyler, you can do sort, and then you can sort by largest to smallest in any value of a pivot table. So what we can see here now is this has sorted this list, these cost centers, by which cost centers are present in the most records in our data set. And that's where we come up with, and many of you did get this right, if you add these three up, you get 113,074. That's how many employees are in the top three cost centers, right? And at Sneed Incorporated, where they make and sell Sneeds, as we talked about last week, the front line where they're fabricating and circulating the Sneeds is the biggest cost center, right? It's the field, right? The manufacturing plants, and that's where those 102,000 come from. So that's the answer to that question. The next one, how many job codes are in the top three cost centers? This is one that stymied most of you because what we need to find here is a unique value of job codes, right? So we need to know how many job codes there are because we know from the previous exercises, right? We know that there's only 285 job codes total. So now we want to know how many job codes are here. The problem is if we just count, if we just go and take job code and drop it in here, it's not going to give me, and by the way, if you need to change the sum, you go to value field settings and you can change it to lots of different things. We want it to be a count, not an average, right? It's still going to give me the same count. And that's because it's not telling me how many unique job codes there are. It's telling me how many times a job code is present, but it's not unique. right? So if we want to know how many unique job codes there are, we have to crack it in a little different way. So in this case, we're going to get rid of this guy, and we're actually going to put cost centers up here. And actually, before I do that, let me go back and sort this so we know that it's, sorry, 2184, 2344, and 2666 are the 3 biggest cost centers. And that's going to be important in a minute. So we're going to take cost centers out of here, actually, and we're going to put them into a filter. And then we're going to move our job codes over here. So now we have 1 per job code, right? And now, actually, how did I do this last time? Sorry, guys. I am living on the edge here a little bit. Cost centers, cost centers, cost centers, cost centers. Where'd you go? Oh, here it is. This is how I did it. I did it this way. I think I did it this way. I did it this way. Then I filtered for 2184. Then 2344. Add to current selection. Sorry, guys, I'm thinking through this as I did it this afternoon. I should have recorded myself this afternoon figuring it out. Okay, so now we have all of our job codes. And sorry, guys, I am struggling. Had it this afternoon and it's leaving me. I don't usually perform when I'm doing data manipulation, but give me 1 second. I may be able to save myself here with the version of this I built this afternoon. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hedge. I'm going to move on from this, but I will record a version of it and send it out. Does that sound good? Apologies that I'm not doing this on demand, but it's blanking on me at the moment. So we'll come back to that one. I do know that I did it. I just forget how I did it. How many G7s are in Ivan Pitta's organization? That's the last one for right now. And essentially, we're going to go back to sheet 1. We're going to get rid of these for now. We're going to take these out. And now we're going to look at L3 leaders, right? Of which Ivan Pitta is 1. And we're going to say how many employees are in these leaders groups, right? So if we sort this from top to bottom, we can see that the largest L3 has about 10,000. The smallest has 1. But what we're going to say here is we don't really want everybody. We're just talking about L7s. So we're going to go into a filter. We're going to go to number 7. We're going to say, great, I only want to see the 7s. And then if I go down and I find my friend, either by search or by scroll, I can grab Mr. Pitta and I can see that there are 12 records in this data set where Ivan Pitta is their L3 leader and their job grade is 7. So if we think about this organizationally, we're saying how many grade 7s are in his org. But from a data perspective, what we're saying is there's 100,000 records, 119,000 records in this data set. How many of them have Ivan Pitta? And if I get rid of this and I say all, well, 209 of them say Ivan Pitta. That's the size of his whole org. But now I only want to see the ones that are 7. And so if I reduce it down to 7, I get 12. And that's how you get the answer to that question. Cool. This one had a lot of variants. People tried to solve this a lot of different ways. And I got a lot of different numbers. But this is the easiest, fastest, simplest way to do it. Now, we could do that if you didn't want to use a pivot table. I'll give you one other way to do this. You could essentially filter, right? So if you're more comfortable with filtering than with pivot tables, you can say, okay, well, show me all of the folks that are Ivan Pitta, right? And then you can say, and show me all the ones who are also 7s. So I'm getting to the same problem, the same answer, using a different technique. right? Now, the nice thing about a pivot table is you can do other things with it, but this gets you to essentially the same concept. Another nifty thing I'll show you is anywhere in a pivot table, you can double click a number and it will create a new table with just the data that you've created. So if you just wanted those 12 people, you can then sort of like query them out, so to speak. And then if you wanted to send that list to somebody or do something with it, you can do that. Cool. Thoughts, questions, comments?
Chris, there was a couple of good questions in there around, I was responding to them, but I think for the group's benefit, it'd be good to hear you talk about the importance of using a unique identifier in files like this versus like manager name or a person's name. Why is that important in these type of data sets? And then there was also a really good question about what does quote unquote unique mean?
Yep. So there's two extremely good reasons to have unique identifiers. The first is for privacy, right? It's better if you can avoid it to not be sending employees' names around your organization. So anytime you can use something like an employee ID that's nondescript, you're now not worried about personally identifiable information, right? So anytime you can email, store, move data and not have PII in it, as long as you have a primary key, like an employee ID that can connect back to that later, you can feel safe that you're protecting the identity of the employees whose data you're working with. So that's one really good reason to be using a unique identifier, especially one that's not like an email address or an alias or something that de facto reveals their name. The second reason is that it's literally the only lifeline that you have to connect data to other data. If you don't have a unique identifier in data, it is orphaned. It's on an island, and it may exist, but it only exists insofar as the stuff that it's already connected to. A great example of this is survey data. Tons of companies create survey data all the time. They have SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or Perceptyx or some system where they can go out and they can create surveys. And they create surveys, but they don't actually ask you to identify yourself. And so you get this survey and you get all this data and they're like, cool, what is that like? How's the split for men versus women? Well, we didn't ask for men versus women. Well, great, go connect it back to the roster data. Well, how are you going to do that if you didn't ask for an identifier in the survey, like an email address, as an example, right? So the importance of a unique identifier is so that you can connect data to other data. What does unique mean? Unique means one of a kind. It means it cannot be replicated anywhere else. It means that there's probably more than one John Smith at your company. And because there's more than one John Smith at your company, you can't use last name, comma, first name, because there's always going to be more than that. If you work at large and or international companies, you will also find that names vary. So as an example, if you work a lot with South America, in South American cultures, folks often have 4 or 5 names because their family names tend to stack. And so they may have 3 names that sound like a first name, but they go by Maria. And if you don't know that, you're not really going to be able to tell Maria Gonzalez from, Yolanda, right? So you have to be able to tell that. In Asian countries that work with English-speaking countries, Asian employees often take on an American-sounding name, right? So you may know them as Grace Yang, but their name is something incredibly different that in the system it says, but you don't know them as that because they go by Grace. Their email says Grace, their Outlook says Grace. All of the stuff that you've ever seen about this person says Grace, but in the system, that's not what their name is because that's not their legal name that they use for things like taxes. But guess what will be the same? Their email address will be the same. Their employee ID will be the same, right? So especially as you start working with bigger and bigger data, something like a name that feels unique often does not become unique and certainly isn't necessarily unique across systems. Thoughts, questions, comments on this? Does that answer the question?
I think that was a great answer from my perspective, Chris. It added some more color to what I put in the chat, but I guess just from those askings, does that help? Is that helpful? Any follow-up questions on that though? Because that isn't it. Those are important questions to ask, and I appreciate the fact that you are asking those.
Yeah,
All good
and you
on
should
those?
always be demanding anytime you see a data table, what's the unique identifier here? Is it an alias? Is it an email address? Or is it an employee ID? And if it's not one of those 3 things, it's probably not good enough. All right. We spent 48 minutes so far, so we only have a little bit less than, or a little bit more than an hour left. I do want to jump to vignettes. I'm really bugged that I wasn't able to fly through that last example. I'll do some penance on that later. I apologize, folks, but I will get it recorded and get it over to you guys so that you can work on it. So I do want to switch over to vignettes. Vignettes were better. I thought vignettes were good. I think you guys do have some work to do with it. The good news about the vignettes is that this is an evolving exercise. And so as you go, you're going to have more and more opportunities to clean this up. And I haven't talked about this with Ben yet, but I may actually say when we get to the final of your vignette thing, when all your cells are filled out, we may even give you guys a redemption arc to go back and maybe refine some of your stuff for a little bit of extra credit if you want to earn some stuff back. Now, as I read through these, I saw a couple of things that I wanted to make sure I bring up with y'all, and we're going to do this together reasonably quickly, but in a way that hopefully will work out. So the goal of this exercise is essentially not to extrapolate. We're not trying to get to the causal effects yet. We're not even trying to understand whether what the arguers are saying is true or not. The point of where we are right now in argumentation practice is to refine and clarify what they are saying, right? So many of you jumped right to this is driving this, which is driving this, and so bad things are happening, right? As opposed to simply trying to clarify what it is the arguer is saying. And so simplify is the first thing I want you all to think about. Second, some of you guys got into like breaking down the business context. And that's not what we're talking about, right? The business context is to help you understand where we're at. But what we want to be breaking down is what the arguers are talking about, what the actual people that are talking in the vignettes are saying. And so we really want to dig down into what it is we're saying and also not overreaching. So there were some places where we ran way far and started putting out like even potential like solutions or realities. Like, for example, in the return to office example here, they were saying like people come in X days a week. There's nothing in this vignette that talks about that beyond the generalities of the fact that there's some fully remote, some fully in person, and some hybrid stuff going on. So we're going to walk through this one together. And I'm going to steal, I redid it personally so that we can kind of walk through. So first things first, we're going to break down these three concepts and we're going to bring them together here. So I grabbed, they spend their whole time, their whole job in the field. How could they possibly be expected to work in an office on the rare occasion they aren't traveling? It's never been that way, right? This is someone kind of expressing authentically that this RTO thing is ridiculous, right? Which you may or may not have heard over the years if you guys are in actual jobs. It's a very common kind of thread right now running through corporate America. There are those that think we need to come back, and there are those that think that this is stupid, and neither side is particularly well documented in their evidence about why they feel that way. It's just a lot of emotions. But this is a very legitimate concept. And one of the places that takes place is this idea that there are folks that never were expected to come into the office before COVID happened, and now they're being expected to come into office. So in addition, this twisting the knife is like, we're regressing beyond where we were before this whole thing happened. But I want to talk specifically about the premises here, right? And I'm going to grab this and bring it over, and I know I'm bouncing back and forth, but I want to kind of go one at a time here, right? Here is how we break down what this leader is saying. Salespeople aren't home very often because they spend a lot of time on the road. And again, I'm not assessing whether it's true or not, just what he's inferring with his statements or her statements. When they aren't on the road, they don't want to come to the office. That's a big deal. He is inferring that even though he's not directly saying it. They never have been expected to be in an office when they weren't traveling before. That is probably true, right? Based on what we know about how work was before COVID and now, that's what's true. So what is he concluding from these three premises? Therefore, they won't react well to it, right? And what we mean by react well is something we have to define later in hypotheses. But for now, he's just taking this negative conclusion from the fact that they're not home a lot. And so when they are home, they don't want to be at the office. That might not be true. There may be plenty of people who would be happy to be at the office. We don't know. Or they may want to be at the office some of the time, but not all the time. And in fact, somebody calls them out and says, well, that's not really true. A lot of your salespeople come to the office all the time. And he's like, well, those aren't the people I'm talking about, which might be fair. But do you guys see how we're sort of breaking down the premises of what he's talking about and just rephrasing, but in a simplified way of the argument is really that they're not home a lot. And when they are home, they don't want to be in an office. That's really what he's saying. And therefore, because there's no precedent for this, if we force it, bad things are going to happen. Anything in the chat, Ben?
There's some questions, side conversation about the hybrid topic specifically. Becca has a good question here though. Yeah, I don't want to ask it for you, Becca. Do you want to just kind of relay what you're thinking there?
Yeah, is it my latest question?
Yeah,
Last
reading
one I
between the
put on
lines, that one.
Yeah. So I've struggled with this in the past, and it's, when something's literally stated, are we technically reading between the lines of, what they aren't saying? Like, they're not going to be stating the actual problem, they're stating like a symptom of the problem. So we're kind of like reading between the lines and trying to like go beyond what they're just literally stating.
Yeah. One of the most powerful techniques a consultant has in his or her toolbox is, let me restate what you said so I can make sure I understand. And when you say that, what you're telling them is A, you're listening, B, you're interpreting, and C, you really are checking to see if you're on the same page as them. Because one of the most common things that happens in data analysis and research and consulting in general is what they say and what you hear are not the same thing. And so you go off and you build something for a problem that they didn't ask, right? And so the whole point of this exercise is kind of forcing you guys to get in and to use your term, Becca, read between the lines and say, all right, this guy is saying they spend their whole job in the field. How could they possibly be expected to work in an office on the rare occasion that they aren't traveling? If you take that sentence for what it's worth, right, you can say, oh, well, I think he's inferring that when they're home, they don't want to be in the office because they're not home a lot. Do you guys see? And I'll say this is definitely an inductive argument, but we're sort of interpreting that they're on the road a lot. How could they possibly be expected to work in the office on the rare occasion that they aren't traveling? We're really digging into what we're concluding or what we think the premises of this argument are. And then it's never been that way connects to the premise of they've never been expected to be in an office when they weren't traveling before. Bailey?
So can you get different interpretations from it? Because the way I read they spend their whole job in the field is like that's what salespeople need to do their job is they're in the field trying to sell and market and stuff like that. So is there a possibility for it to be interpreted in different ways?
Of course. And that's kind of the purpose of the exercise, right? Is for you to dig into that. You have to take the context, you have to take the context of what's there together though, right? Because it's not just they spend their whole job in the field. The leader then says, how can they possibly be expected to work from an office on the rare occasion that they aren't traveling? He's really adding in, or she is adding in feelings, right? And oftentimes leaders are projecting their own feelings on a situation on their entire team or their entire organization. And so what I might say to a leader like this is help me understand, are you saying that you don't think that your leaders, when they're not traveling, want to be home? No, of course not. How could they possibly? Okay, cool. Like, how do you know? Have you asked them? Is there some kind of data that's causing you to say that? Is it a personal feeling because you were a sales rep for 15 years and like it's a fact? Like, tell me how you reach that premise that people don't want to be in an office when they're not in the field. Is that helpful? There is definitely interpretation to be had, and I want to double down on what Bailey said. 100%. What I'm saying here, what I wrote, is I'm saying if somebody said to me, they spend their whole job in the field, how could they possibly be expected to work in an office on the rare occasion they aren't traveling? I would assume that their premise are they're not home a lot, and when they are home, they don't want to be in an office. Julie.
So with the component statements, it's taken like from the context, the scenario, right? So we don't infer the components that we infer when we present the premises and conclusion.
Yes, that is actually an important point because I saw both sides of this. People who basically just dissected the vignette in both columns, so they never really added any inference, and others that never really took component statements and they just it was all inferences. So to your point, Julie, the point of the exercise is column C is you're supposed to be taking literal statements. Here's what was said. And then in the premises, the conclusions, you're sort of making inferences about what you think the components of their argument are in the premises, and then what conclusion they're reaching as a result of it. Thank you for asking that question. All right, we're going to move on to the next one. They, employees, work faster, collaborate more frequently, and make better decisions. People just do better work when they are physically present. The premises here are pretty explicit. People work faster when they're physically together. They collaborate more frequently when they're physically together. They make better decisions when they are physically together. Therefore, people should be together as often as possible. That's kind of what she's saying here, right? What the CHRO is saying. So my question to you guys here is, what would be the next, like for this one, the premises were pretty spelled out for you, right? She is making this argument here. But what would we need to challenge as researchers here? Like, what would be the first thing we would want to say to them or say to the CHRO?
I mean, the first thing that pops in my head is like, is that true? Do we know that people work faster together or that they make better decisions? That's just what pops in my head.
That's exactly right, Becca. Like, we want to dig into the veracity of the premises. Okay, it's easy to say people work faster when they're together and they collaborate more frequently and they make better decisions when they're physically together. But the question is that true? And if it is true, is it true all the time for all groups in all circumstances? And the problem is, or the answer is not usually, right? As an example, I think some of the research showing now, if you have high trust, high tenure teams, they tend to work very well in a hybrid or remote situation, whereas new teams that haven't been together a long time tend not to do that, right? It's a lot of work to absorb new norms, for example, if you're a low tenure employee and it's hard to assimilate and onboard to a culture, versus if you know all that stuff because you were in person for 10 years before this happened. It doesn't work that way. It's not a clean answer, but it's definitely not in all situations, for all jobs, for all employees. These premises are true. Becca.
I'm just having a hard time like walking through this in my head, like trying to go through this again, because when I look at the logic statements for the first one and the second one seems very intuitive. It's work fast. It's like restating basically what the component statement is, but then the first one feels like it's a lot more inferential. Like why didn't we do, like, for the first premise, sales people spend their whole job in the field, and the second premise, like, they're rarely not traveling, and then I don't know, like the third premise, they won't react well to it now, or like they've never been expected to be in office when they weren't traveling. And so then, like, why isn't the first one exactly restating each line like the second one is?
Yep. I kind of did this a little bit on purpose, Becca, in that the first one is a little bit more abstract and the second one is a little bit more kind of hit you in the face with the argument that's being made. Because sometimes leaders will be very clear about what they're saying. And the CHRO is being relatively clear. She's saying, I know that people work better together. And then she defines what she means by that, right? Sometimes you'll get that from a leader. And then you kind of understand where they're coming from. And then all you have to do is challenge the veracity of whether the statement is true or not, but they're not unclear about what they mean. In the sales directors, he wasn't really, or she wasn't really, I keep going to he because I don't know, it feels like a he, I don't know why. The sales director is really more focused on emotion, right? If you look at the type of language he's using, what he's saying, he's not being super objective. He's just kind of ranting. And we're pulling out what he means. And so it requires more inference. And that's why the argument feels a little bit more inductive.
Mm.
And by the way, folks, I want to go back to Bailey's point that it's not like if you didn't write these three things, you got the question wrong. There's a lot of interpretation here. And the goal is for y'all to think about what is being said and what are they trying to get to as a result of what they're saying.
So kind of what you're illustrating here is like the different ends to which we would approach, how do I say this? Like you're not just reading the actual statements they're saying, but you're also reading how it's being stated. So like the emotional ranting versus this is what I've seen, A, B, C. And so you're matching that exact answer with a very exact like logic flow. And then the first one is has more emotion and is more ranty. So you're trying to extrapolate the meaning by making inferential statements. So you're showing us that it can vary between something that's more inferential and something that's more like boom, boom, boom.
Right. And you're going to find leaders across this whole spectrum. Leaders who know what they mean or think they know what they mean, whether they're right or not. They're going to tell you what they mean. And others that are going to be very emotionally driven. And so Ben and I have attempted to write these vignettes in a very kind of rich way with emotional language, with adjectives, right? Because that's the way you're going to get these data in real life. Some people are going to be very confident and very objective, and their premises are going to be super wrong. Other people are going to be super emotional and super unclear, but they're 100% right. And you're going to get everything in between. And so as you go through the vignettes over the next several weeks, you're going to see these different kinds of looks, and you're going to have to dissect them in order to create what the premises are. And sometimes you're going to have to read in and read between the lines and say, how could they possibly be expected to work in an office? And understand what that means is he probably doesn't feel good about that, because either he wouldn't be saying it that way if he did feel good about it. Versus the CHRO, who is very much like, people work better together. Boom, boom, boom. That's what I mean. Clear as mud, right? Welcome to working with people.
Psychology.
Yes. Anybody who told you that research was going to be a lot of logic and data, yes, there's a ton of that. But when you do behavioral science, it all comes back to the messiness, right? All forms of miscommunication come through the art of language. There's a much more eloquent quote about it that I'm forgetting. I'll see if I can find it for you guys.
But just
language is the source of all miscommunication. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, one of my favorites is Stephen Hawking, who said that mankind's greatest achievements have come about by talking and greatest failures by not.
Yeah,
that's a good one. But and it's also, I think, fairly true. But this is a really important point with the vignettes, for example. I don't know that we shared this, but Chris and I constructed these to be extremely relevant. These are ones that they started with scenarios that we have actually seen. And we tried to put in a little bit of that language so you get a flavor of that. This is kind of how things are relayed, where go-to-market leaders like sales leaders, finance leaders, the CEO, they tend to talk very briefly. They tend to be very direct. They tend to say it, it is what it is, and then they move on. And what you're going to find, and you'll see these in these scenarios, is when you have an HR persona, oftentimes they're going to qualify things more. They understand that it's not all or nothing. Like Brittany said in the chat, absolutes. They usually, HR is pretty good about that. A lot of them have very similar training to this. They're used to working with people. They understand the realities of, hey, that might work for this person and not the other, the individual differences. So I just wanted to echo that these scenarios are not just totally random. These are very realistic scenarios that you will likely run into, and you're going to run into these types of people. You're going to run into many of these scenarios. So I just wanted to share that because, paying attention to the substance in the scenarios is actually instructive as well.
Yeah. And I'm giving away sort of the future vignettes a little bit. But if we go back to the sales leader here, one of the things we might say is, okay, well, How much time are they on the road? Could we quantify that? If we quantify that and we find out that maybe only some very small percentage are on the road a lot, then his argument kind of falls apart. And you say, okay, yeah, well, if 5% of your people are on the road 80% of the time, sure, maybe they shouldn't be subject to RTO. But what about the other 80, what about the other large chunk of your organization, right? And then that's when you start to be able to break things down and say, okay, well, if your argument is that you shouldn't be subject to RTO because you're on the road a lot, and because people don't want to come to the office when they're not on the road, we have to test those two things. Are they on the road a lot? Cool. Let's define what that means. Okay, they don't want to come to the office. How do we know? Can we define that? Cool, right? And then, were they not ever expected before? Do we have cases where people didn't come to the office and they were told to come to the office and there was actually a policy and maybe it was or wasn't enforced, right?
Isn't it going to be a hard variable to figure out if people want to come into office? Because if you say yes, that I don't want to come into office, it's going to sound very touchy as far as like an employee goes. Like, I wouldn't personally say that on a survey. I don't care what you're asking me. I wouldn't say that.
Yeah, I do want to keep us focused on sort of the premises of argumentation rather than the validity of a given argument. I'm with you. Social desirability bias and RTO is a thing. But the point is more that we could pick a variable and then figure out how to measure it. But we need to, in order to pick a variable, we have to know what the actual premise is that we're trying to quantify, right? Okay, so we spent about 70 minutes on 60 minutes of a topic, so we're going to jump over. I hope this was helpful and instructive as you guys do more vignettes. Dr. Ben has another one for us that we're going to be working through next week, and we're going to do a vignette every week until we get a vignette exercise every week until we get to the final two that are going to be used for your final project. And the data manipulation, you're going to have this recording, and I'll add the supplemental recording so that you guys have that. And we're going to move a little bit into HR lifecycle and HR tech. Sound good for everybody? All right, here we go.
Real quick, Chris, they were asking, do they get a chance to resubmit the vignettes? I think you looked at them a little closer. I don't think that's necessary. Do you, Chris?
We're not gonna,
This
no,
week?
not right now.
Yeah.
We're gonna grade them, and I'll talk with Dr. Ben. I'm thinking maybe for like the last version of the vignettes, like 4, maybe you kind of get like one redo on stuff if you want to update. But I think we're gonna not this week, next week, or the following week, but maybe week 4. Stay tuned.
Yeah, it's kind of like bowling when you throw away your worst score to get your average. So we might do that. We'll see.
Yeah.
But you'll get a chance to build
cool.
on these for the next few weeks. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. All right. So week 2, we're gonna talk a little bit about analytics and where analytics happens. This is a model that was given to me by a lady named Alexis Fink, who's a rock star in our industry. She runs people analytics for Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook. And I hope she's not mad at me for stealing it, but she did teach it to me, so I guess it's on her. So this is an important one because we're going to talk about the HR lifecycle. And in the HR lifecycle is where we do HR analytics. And HR analytics really happens on kind of 3 primary axes that we're going to get into throughout this course, not directly, but it's an important model to keep in mind. The first is the employee lifecycle, from hire to retire. You're going to hear me say hire to retire a lot in the next 50 minutes. So keep that in mind. But there are other ways that analytics happens. The next is the level of aggregation that you're analyzing, right? You can do individual analytics. Is Mariah going to quit next week or not? Or you can do market level analytics. Are software developers turning over at a higher rate than they have been in the last several years? And so the level of aggregation where you do your analytics matters as well. And then the third axis in the cube, if that's not given away, is the idea of methodological sophistication. So we're going to spend a lot of time this semester on the front end of this, right? Descriptive statistics, basic inferentials. But there is a large spectrum going from counting to what Alexis calls clever counting, all the way down to artificial intelligence and very extreme levels of leveraging math to say interesting things about the future. So that makes the cube, right? We can analyze from hire to retire. We can analyze from an individual all the way up to a market or an organization. And then we can measure very simply, or we can measure in a very complex way. Now, this matters a lot because HR analytics shows up at organizations in lots of different places. You don't have to write these down, but I'm going to run through a few you may have heard of before. Learning and development analytics. We're doing all levels of aggregation, all levels of sophistication, but we're just doing it about that middle part of the life cycle. Compared to talent acquisition analytics, which happens on the front end of the life cycle, or turnover reporting, which is just about the end of the life cycle, but only the simple counting part, or advanced research, which is a big one now in big organizations where they're just doing the fancy math, but they don't do any of the reporting or the more simple analytics. Enterprise analytic, where they only care about big groups and they don't care about little groups. They're opposite, the line of business analytics, who are dealing with the day-to-day stuff that are happening, right? And why am I running you through all of these? The reason is analytics often struggles to strategize and minimize where you have overlap, because HR analytics has been growing and growing and growing over these years, but no one's really like sat back, pulled up, and optimized this stuff. So I want you guys to keep hire to retire in mind, because that's really the important part. But as you think about analytics and where it happens and how it happens, this model is a really helpful one for thinking about who's doing what HR analytics work and why. Why do they care about it? What is their motivation? And how does it partner with other parts of the organization that may be doing similar analytics? Ben, do you have anything to add to that before we go?
Nope, keep going.
All right. So, three important people when we're talking about how HR analytics happens or organizational research happens. You've got the employee, your manager, and HR. These are the three primary kinds of users. We're going to introduce a couple more in the future, but these are the three main ones that we want to talk about when we talk about the HR lifecycle and the technology that underpins it. Importantly, it's not so much their individual experience, so that is important. It's the relational experience that's really, really critical. So the employee who's talking to HR, HR who's talking to a manager who's talking to an employee. And we're going to get into discussions on this in a little bit. But the idea is you have individual experiences. I need to go in and check my pay stub. You have relational experiences. I need to have a performance management conversation with my boss. Or you have other experiences, like a manager and HR person who is doing talent management for a whole team, as an example. So relational and individual relationships matter with regard to how the employee lifecycle happens. So as we think about hire and retire, that entire hire to retire cycle happens in this relational manner. From talent acquisition, and I hope you guys watched the long video that Ben and I recorded about this. There's all these different parts of the life cycle that we're going to review in a minute, but they all happen in this relational setting. Me as an individual, but me with Ben, my boss, me with Chelsea, my HR partner, right? Now, attract and select, we're going to go through these one by one. So this is the test from your guys' reading. So attract and select, that's a gimme. That's essentially the whole front end of the life cycle. So how are we bringing people in? How are we attracting them? And then how are we assessing whether they're a good fit for the organization or not? What's the next one? Anybody remember?
Engage
Onboard and
and
assimilate.
retain. Oh, yeah, that's the second.
Yep, onboard and assimilate. That's a good one. And Ben and I talked at length about this and about how a lot of companies stick these two together, but we struck it apart purposefully because oftentimes everybody knows who owns attract and select, but organizations often struggle to get clarity about who owns the part when you have a new hire who's trying to figure out their way around. They're trying to find friends. They're trying to know where the cafeteria is. They're trying to figure out how to set up their paycheck so it direct deposits. They're doing all these things that are really, really influencing. If you bring this back as an example to biological development of humans, right? What happens in the first 7 years of our life has an unbelievably significant impact on who we become for the rest of it. The same thing happens with an employee experience. We're really good at creating first impressions, and we're really bad at changing those impressions. So this is an incredibly important part of the employee life cycle, and it frankly doesn't get enough love. Who knows what's third?
Engage and reward.
Engage and reward. Excellent. So engage and reward is all about how we go about keeping people interested in doing their work, right? Part of this is the idea of engagement, which is a weaponized term that's very, very fussy, and we're not going to get into all the messiness of it today. But essentially, when you're doing a good job of this, people feel connected. They feel that they matter. They feel that their work matters. and overall they're interested. Reward is the fact that at the end of the day, not to be cold-hearted about it, but people are exchanging their time and money for a living wage. That's what they're doing, right? They're not here because they are volunteering their time. That is a thing sometimes, but typically most working relationships, we're exchanging our effort for some kind of reward. But that's not just money, right? It's all kinds of things. It can be belonging, it can be recognition, it can be benefits or perks, in addition to the obviously the compensation that's the most famous in this category. What's next?
Develop.
Develop. Cool. Now, this is separated from engage and reward, although sometimes development is part of engage and reward, but development is all about how are we helping people achieve their best selves. I know that sounds a little bit like a cat poster, but a huge part of human need is this idea of mastery. It's a fundamental need that shows up in just about every modern motivational needs theory that's out there. People left to their own devices want to be good at stuff. They don't like to be bad at stuff. Not everybody's hyper competitive or hyper ambitious, but people tend to like to show up and do a good job in general. And development is all about organizations' formalized efforts to making that happen, right? Either by giving them the ability to do it themselves, by setting expectations for them to achieve, and other ways of doing that, right? This is often called the learning and development department, and talent management also gets involved.
And Chris, if I may add a quick interesting anecdote for you all, is that as we've been doing research on what's important to employees across the globe over the last few years, we've seen that attitudes change based on the external environment. I think we might have mentioned that last week, but growth and development has been something that has stayed consistently highly important to people relative to other potential drivers of things like engagement and whether they want to stick around. So development is not one of the, like, this is there as a meta category for very good reason, because if companies focus on actually developing their people, and that doesn't mean just promotion, by the way, that means really developing their skills, giving them opportunities to try new things, giving them opportunities to expand their jobs, job expansion, or try a different job for a while, go through training. Those things have a huge influence on whether they're going to be engaged in their role, whether they're going to find their work fulfilling, and whether they're going to stick around. So I just thought I would add that.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Ben. The other thing I'll say about development is that it means different things to different people, right? Which is another reason I think it's universally loved, because for some people, it's the thing they need to get to the next rung on the ladder. To others, it's about self-efficacy, right? To others, it's about, showing up better for their teammates, right? But everybody can find something that's important to them when it comes to development, right? For others, it's the organization showing that they care about you, right? And that relationship matters. So it is a big one. What's next?
Advance.
Advance. Now, advance is one of my favorites. Talent management is near and dear to my heart, but advance is kind of all these things together because we have to be thinking strategically about how we are marshaling our resources around the organization so that they can learn and they can grow, so that we can select the right people, so that we can set them up for success in an onboarding kind of way, so that they continue to feel engaged and rewarded. So advancement is all about how are we helping to move talent around the organization so that it is good for them and it's good for the organization overall, right? And this is a whole heck of a lot more than just promotions. It's the whole idea of talent management. And last,
Separation.
separation. Everybody stops working eventually. That might sound a little macabre, but nobody works forever, right? And whether you're going off to a different job or you're going off to a different company or you're retiring, all good things must come to an end. And this life cycle has its own end, which is separation. A lot of companies villainize the idea of separation, and it's typically because they have too much of it, and or when people leave, they don't usually leave for good reasons. But I'm here to tell you that turnover is not necessarily bad. You need a healthy amount of turnover. And really good companies see turnover as a potentially positive thing because you're sending ambassadors out, right? People that loved your company, had a great experience, they've moved on to something else, but then they're talking well about your organization at other companies, and oftentimes they come back. In the industry, we call those boomerangs, somebody who leaves a company and then comes back to it, and or if they're talking great about your company, now it's a heck of a lot easier for you to hire people from that new company. So the idea of having a good employee brand, turnover can be a very positive thing if it's not overly villainized, but separation is a really important part, especially at large organizations. Ben, you got something on that?
Yeah, quick anecdote on that. Some of the if you've heard of the term the Big Four consulting firms, if you're not familiar with that, that's okay. We talk a lot about it in consulting. That usually is we're talking about McKinsey, we're talking about Bain, we're talking about Boston Consulting Group. These companies have a model where, for example, if you're very serious about being a business consultant in the future, and you might want to go work for McKinsey or Bain, you go in and they tell you right away, you're going to work 80 hours a week. It's going to be brutal. But if you make it past that and you want, and hey, not everybody's going to become a partner. In fact, you're probably not gonna. You're not going to become a partner. Some do, but they want you to come in 2-3 years and they want to send you right out to go into the industry because then you're going to bring McKinsey in. And so, to Chris's point, there are different organizational strategies. Some organizations, especially in a B2C environment where our retail, quick serve restaurants, leisure, hospitality, they naturally have very high turnover. Those are the industries that tend to look at turnover as a negative. Turnover equals bad. But to Chris's point, even in those industries, it's not necessarily bad. But there are some companies that are just going to philosophically look at it very differently and look at turnover as not necessarily being bad. That's an opportunity to put a future customer out there or a brand advocate. And so there's not a one right way. It's just calling attention to there will be different types of industries. There's different companies out there that have a very different view on turnover. But oftentimes, if you're an analyst in one of those companies or you're a consultant in one of those companies, you might have to make an argument as to, hey, we're talking about turnover as a thing, as if it's just one thing, but there's more nuance there. And so you're actually going to see some vignettes later that we're going to introduce that dig into that challenge that assumption. So I wanted to add a little bit of color commentary there too, not only for you as future consultants and IOs, but also if you're on the job hunt.
Excellent. So let's bring it back. So instead of it being hire to retire now, we've taken this slightly more nuanced approach and said, okay, well, each of these different sections exist between my employee, HR, and my manager. But now we're going to bring in the two additional user types that I promised that I would. And that is the software and data people who are dealing with this on the back end, and then the specialists, right? And when I say specialists, I typically mean this is going to be at medium or larger organizations where an HR professional is focused on a particular part of the employee lifecycle, like compensation or talent analytics or talent acquisition or learning and development. So now we've added this additional angle. And I know this may sound like I'm just making this bigger and more complicated, but I'm bringing it to a point, I promise. Because where we live, right, as the research and analytics people, we have to understand this employee lifecycle and how it's generating data in all of these different kinds of places. I want to bring us back to last week when we talked about digitalization and the fact that we've digitalized this entire experience, right? And so because of that, these data are being created and managed in all of these different relationships for all of these different for all of these 6 different things, for all of these different kinds of users. And if that sounds intimidating, it should. There's a lot. So now we're going to put these two things together that we just talked about, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion, right? So if you see on the left there, we've got all of our different users that we just talked about. And across, we've got the different parts of the employee life cycle. And so I want to talk about these 4 major questions for about 15 minutes or so. So what kinds of employee experiences would require interfacing with technology? What systems would an employee have to interface to make those experiences happen? What kinds of data would that create? And then how might different groups want or need those data to run their business or their part of the business? So I'm going to jump down to this slide, and I believe I put it in my notes here. There we go. We might be able to zoom this out a little bit. And now I want to hear from you guys. And I know a lot of you are in jobs now, or you have experience with these jobs. And even if you don't be afraid to jump in and talk about some things. So let's talk about the first one. What kinds of employee experiences require interfacing with technology? And think about it as a function of these 6 areas.
I know that like develop and advance might have to deal with some sort of trainings, which can be online depending on the nature of the job.
Okay. So what kind of training? Be a little more specific.
Well, like maybe like let's say it's a leader development program and there might be a culture training that could be happening.
Okay. And we're gonna come back.
Attract.
I'm gonna keep these agnostic of the actual users because we're gonna come back to that in a minute. But so leader development training, that's a good example. What else do we got?
Attract's going to definitely use technology, and then also onboard and assimilate.
Okay, so what let's do attract and select. What kind of
The ATS system.
Not tech, what experiences? We can get to tech in a minute. But what would I do as a candidate?
Oh, okay. As a candidate using the technology, actually applying for the job online, doing a virtual meeting. Yeah.
Apply for a job, interview. Cool. All right, great. And then what else? Give me another one.
For onboard and assimilate, like onboarding paperwork.
Okay. Yeah, so pre-hire stuff like I-9, right? What else? What else in onboarding and assimilate do they need to do?
I would add orientation.
Okay, yeah. Like how do I get my orientation scheduled? What else in onboard and assimilate? That's a good one that we don't talk about enough as an industry.
It'd be like creating like your like I know we use Dayforce, and when new employees come in, they have to create their Dayforce account.
Okay, so systems access.
Yes.
I thought you were going in another direction, which is an onboarding plan, right? Most large systems now have a plan that you can create and manage. At Amazon, it's called Embark. Different companies have different versions of it, but it's like, here's what you're supposed to do in the first 30, 60, 90 days. Who am I supposed to meet? What the hell do all these acronyms mean, right? Like it's, onboarding plans are a big one. Okay. What about engage and reward?
Sorry, I just had a question on onboarding. Would a training plan be separate from onboarding, since a lot of the times it can be? Like a training
be a
schedule.
subcomponent of it.
Yeah.
Of the
They
training
would
you
be
have to go
managed.
through and win.
The answer to your question, Chelsea, is they would be managed in the same technology system, but they would be for different purposes, right? Onboarding training is typically compliance related, whereas development training is typically skill related. What about engage and reward?
I just have an idea of what subscription, like access to subscriptions count to engage and reward.
Access. Yeah, I'm just gonna call that like perk access.
Yeah.
Like if your company gives you 20% off at LA Fitness, you might have to like work through your company's system to get that, right? To get that perk. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Or like you get access to a free,
like
that's a good one.
Netflix,
Perk
like
access.
working here.
What else in engage and reward? Yep.
Would you count PTO as part of that? I know it's like you get like a certain amount of hours, but you can like look it up and all that stuff, like keeping track of your PTO time.
PTO management. Yep.
You could also do like recognition, like online recognition forms. Like there's ways to submit those.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
There's a whole industry for that.
There's an entire industry dedicated to that exact thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What about networking?
Yeah.
As engagement.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good one. Slack, GChat, whatever communication technology you use. Yeah.
That's great. All right. let's jump over to advance.
For advanced, could you do like the internal application system, like to be able to look and see what roles are already available that you can apply to
Yep,
internally?
internal talent
Internal
acquisition,
job
great
board.
one.
Mm-hmm.
What about
And I'll-
talent
I'll-
assessments?
Talent, yep, assessments. I'll add recommendation. That's a big one now. That's like recommendation engines. So it'll say, hey, here's what we know about you, and because of here's what we know about you, here are the kinds of jobs we think inside of the company might be interesting to you. I haven't been impressed by them, but they're out there. What else do we have in advance?
Surveys, online surveys.
Yeah,
Where,
that's I think I might put that more in like engage and reward, but
Mhm.
I'm with you that surveys are important. Don't think like an employee, think like a manager or an HR person for a minute. What kinds of experiences would a
Workshops.
manager have when thinking about advancement? Maybe not of themselves, but of their teams.
Could it be like one-on-one meetings, like in like Zoom meetings with your managers?
Yep, performance management. I'm just going to call that performance management in general, but yeah, there are a lot of tools out there so that you can help your people grow. So it's kind of development, but it's also kind of advanced.
Is there another like separate, because performance management to me is like the record of the conversations. Or you said something in the lecture video that was like there's a difference between the data that's collected from performance management, like you separated it out, but is
Oh,
there
the distinction between performance
Uh-huh.
appraisal versus management? Is that what you mean?
Because because like with performance management, I think about like the actual data that you collect from the assessment versus like the conversation someone says, you know, I really want to make it to this role. Like this is what I want to
Oh, yeah.
do. So like there's two sides to performance management that I see, like a development plan almost. Like this employee said that they're interested in this role. So now I understand the steps they need to take to get there versus these are their actual scores from what I like assess.
Yes, career planning versus performance management. It would all kind of probably fall under performance management, but then you
Yeah.
start to, when you talk about career planning, you're kind of towing the line between performance management and talent management. The thing I was looking for that's actually similar to what you're talking about, Becca, is succession planning, right? So a big part of what organizations often manage is who's up next for Ben's job. When Ben gets promoted and goes off to run something else, you know, could Becca be Ben? Could Tyler be Ben? Could LaRue be Ben? We don't know, right? And HR and leadership spend a lot of time, if your organization is worth its salt, thinking about that, right? And there's technology that exists to help you think about that, right? Who's mobile? Who's not mobile? Who's ready in one move? Who's ready now? Who needs two moves? Who's probably never going to get there, but they're good at what they do right now? That kind of gets into more of the overall talent management concept. All right, let's talk about separate.
What
Say exert interviews.
Oh, yep, that's exactly what I was gonna say.
What she said.
Exit interviews for sure.
Like
What
getting
else?
your 1K.
Yep. So rollovers, or I'll call this just like exit benefit conversion.
Like offboarding, like on I don't know if like from the user end, but I know you have to be
Yep.
unenrolled from the system.
Yep,
Mhm.
that's more
Yep.
of a back end thing, but it's definitely critical.
Yep.
How about rehire eligibility? That's a big one for especially large frontline organizations, where if you leave for some reason, depending on why you left and how you left and when you left, you may or may not be able to come back for some certain amount of time. All
How
right.
about EPARs? Because that could also kind of fall into advancement.
What did you say? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
EPARs,
I'm not
I'm not familiar with that.
so like electronic personnel action changes requests.
Oh, so you're talking about like records
Oh.
management. So like if
Yeah.
somebody moves or they
I
get married,
gotcha.
they
Yeah,
change
yeah.
their name or that kind of thing. Yeah, that's a
a
highly
good one.
administrative to your point. I'm not sure necessarily to your point, that's more about data management than it is about employee experience. But it can really mess with the employee experience. Workday was very famous for this. They were some of the first that pulled that ability forward. So, for example, Workday pioneered you can make your name whatever you want on the front end of the system. And so it doesn't change the back end, but if you want to be called Purple Unicorn, God bless you. Call yourself Purple Unicorn and it'll come up in Outlook and it'll do all that stuff. The back end, you're still Julie because that's what your taxes say, but what you show up as, and people love that, right? Because now they could bring more of an authentic version of themselves and it didn't have to go through that highly administrative process. But yeah, I don't know where that would go here though. That's a really thought-provoking question. Probably engage in reward ultimately because of the impact it has, even though it's kind of an administrative process. All right. So we talk. What are you laughing about?
Oh,
Something
we're
in the
just
chat?
having fun while you're teaching. No, somebody Chelsea said
No.
it's a funny chat. They said they're changing Julie's name to Purple Unicorn on their phone.
Oh, got it. Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm not going to go too deep into the systems because I recognize we only have about 20 minutes left. But and in fact, I think I'm going to move from this only because we could probably spend I probably should have earmarked like 40 minutes for this. But you guys will get these slides. You can play around with them because the point I wanted to get at here, and I'll close this out here and then I'll move to the other stuff that I wanted to talk through today, is that each of these employee experiences definitely has an employee attribute to it, but every single one of these types of users has to do something, right? When we talk about applying for a job, the employee or the candidate experiences that. A hiring manager has to have access to who's applying for their job. HR needs to be managing the age and movement and quality of the requisitions. The talent acquisition team is managing the whole engine, right? And they have a slightly deeper, different view than the applicant or HR or the manager. The research and analytics people want to know who's being hired well, and the data people and the software people have to make sure the whole system is technically functioning properly. And what's important for you to keep in mind as you think about this, times all of these different things we talked about across all these different places, is nobody has the same motivation for why they want the data to look the way that they need it to look. Talent acquisition needs the engine to run. The software people need the clicking to work, right? The research people want to know why it's happening, and then the other three are just trying to get through their day job, right? And so when we think about the premises and the arguments and the vignettes and the work that we're going to do, these data spring up in lots of different ways in lots of different places, and lots of different people have lots of different opinions about why it needs to look the way it needs to look. And that all messes with the validity of your data. It all messes with what it says, why it says, how it's refreshed, who owns it, when you can get to it, why it agrees or doesn't agree with some other person's version of that data. And so the idea here was to sort of express the complexity of the ecosystem that exists in most organizations. So moving on. I don't want you to read this. It is a block of text. You can read it later if you want. It's also available at Oracle's website, which is where I stole it from. But 3 terms you're going to hear in your life as an HR person are HRIS, HRMS, and HCM. HRIS stands for HR Information System. HRMS stands for HR Management System. And HCM stands for HR Capital Manager, Human Capital Management System. And these are essentially large, ubiquitous pieces of software that claim to be able to kind of manage the entire HR lifecycle. It started with HRSs a long time ago. That's the oldest term, and is now more typically called HCM when we talk about things like Oracle or SAP or Workday that are all in systems. There are smaller versions too for medium companies, for smaller user groups, but the essence of these concepts is that they've had an evolution over a long time, and that history is important when you think about the complexity of the data system that you have to deal with. HRISs tend to be more back-end focused. They were focused on organizing data and compliance and scale, whereas these more recent systems are more app-based, right? They're more based in the 21st century, and they're focused on the user experience, and they're focused on organizing processes and making it easy for end users to exist at the company. And the reason that these two differences matter is that in the back end, we dealt a lot more with organizing data and compliance, and data was a little bit cleaner and easier. Now that we're trying to make it easier for the end user, that's great for the end user, but ultimately what it does is it makes it harder for the data analyst. Because in my opinion, we have in this day and age more data than we've ever had, like orders of magnitude more data than we've ever had in the past, and yet we have less information. We have less insight, we have less wisdom. Because now, instead of having a small amount of data that we have to do a lot with, we have a huge amount of data and no way to organize and dive into it. So the essence of organizational research now in the space of HR is not so much the traditional IO mindset of, I'm going to come up with an idea and I'm going to test that idea. It's going to be, how do I jump into this massively complex ecosystem of data that exists in all of those ways that we've just discussed, and have any hope of being able to connect it in a way that I can do something that's meaningful. Big challenge, but a cool one.
And I might add really quickly, this is one of the reasons why IO psychology has emerged as one of the fastest growing jobs in the last couple of years, is because of that exact point. Massive amounts of data, less information. Sometimes at Qualtrics, we talk about you have data, but you don't have insights. Same way of saying what Chris is saying. That's why this stuff is so critical and why IOs are so valued right now. So you're in a good field.
You are. You're in an absolutely good field. What IO doesn't quite do yet, and I applaud Ben Wood for thinking about this and getting a whole bunch of practitioners in to run this program, is, wait a minute, IOs are trained in science. They're not data engineers, typically, right? They're not really trained in database management. And I'm not saying that you need to do that to be a successful IO psychologist, but I am saying that the rules of engagement have changed. Because now, instead of going out and being a scientist and creating hypotheses and then going and generating your data and then testing that data, most of the data is already out there. You've got to go corral it, wrangle it, and make sense of it using good principles of research methods and statistics, not going from soup to nuts like you're in a laboratory and creating a hypothesis, writing a survey, analyzing that survey, and then moving on to the next research question. That is a thing to do, but it is far and away becoming less and less the majority of organizational researchers. It is a lot more about diving in and finding the gold in the mountain than it is about building something from scratch. Cool. All right. So we got 15 minutes left. I do want to talk through, and if you watch that video, this is a little bit deeper into that, but I want to rerun some of the different kinds of technologies that exist, because the human capital management systems say they can do it all, and they do technically do it all. But like any single tool that's being asked to do a lot, it doesn't do any of the individual things super incredibly well. And so some organizations are all in on these cloud systems like Workday, and they do pretty well, but most of them have at least one, and some of them have many appendage systems that are plugged in to the human capital management system. And some people that can't afford an overall HCM just have their own tech stack that's put together. Talent acquisition technology, Tyler already mentioned applicant tracking systems, but the whole idea is that there's an entire industry of stuff that exists at the front end of the life cycle, and the job of that is to manage candidates, turn applicants into candidates, turn candidates into employees, right? And then it pairs up with an internal system of some kind. This also includes like connecting to job boards and other external kinds of things. Employee listening. This is a group in and of itself. Dr. Ben is the expert here far and away. But essentially, companies want to know what people think. And so there is a ton of technology out there whose job it is to figure out how we can ascertain that. Sometimes we're asking them questions. Sometimes we're doing 360s. Sometimes it's a voice of the customer, or voice of the employee, or escalation systems. But it's our attempt as an organization to say, we want to know what you think because that's important to us. But that generates a ton of data that then has to be analyzed and understood. Third, learning management systems. This is another hugely robust, entirely independent industry on its own. There's actually a new term, I'm forgetting the term of it, but learning management system is sort of an older term for, or we organize our classes and our courses and that kind of stuff. But learning engagement systems tend to be a little bit more angled at the learning experience, right? Creating a bit of a more of a curated approach to what matters to me in my development. And so learning management systems have been getting better and better over the years, and they're attempting to stay relevant in this world of advanced analytics, and HCMs. Common benefits, highly administrative, highly critical, also really important. You got to manage your money, you got to manage your benefits. There's a lot of legal and tax and all kinds of implications with comp and benefit systems. In my experience, this isn't everybody's experience, but this tends to be finance and HR clothing, right? Compensation in general tends to be finance and HR clothing. And so these systems tend to live very, very close to, if not totally underneath the jurisdiction of the finance department. Performance management and talent management from the HR perspective, and then performance management from the ops perspective. So I break these out this way because Becca already brought up the idea that this line between assessing someone's performance and driving their career and then managing the organization is kind of this tiered approach from how are you doing, how do you want to do, and then what does the organization need, and how do you match to that? Those are kind of the tiers from performance management to talent management. We don't really have time to get into all of that, but from the very tactical aspect of am I tracking your ratings and performance improvement plans and things like that, all the way through succession plans like talent cards. Well, you know, what is your potential rating? Are you mobile? Where are you going? Who are you the backfill for if that person should leave tomorrow? All of those kinds of things live in this world of performance and talent management. And I break out the ops version of that because organizations do things, right? They sell things, they make things, they ship things. And so the speed and quality and efficiency with which they're doing that has to be tracked. And those tasks are typically done by humans, and humans' ability to do those tasks are also typically tracked. But that's fundamentally different than the behavioral aspect of a person's career. How well I sell something might make me a good salesperson, but it also makes money for the company. And so sometimes I care about how much money I made for the company, and sometimes I care if I performed well. And those are different things, and organizations often conflate them, right? So I might care if I work in a warehouse, how many boxes I can throw an hour, because I need to know how many humans I need on a shift to successfully throw enough boxes. But then I may also want to know how performance trends are indicating whether I have a culture problem or not, right? I might use the same piece of data, boxes per hour, to do two entirely different kinds of work. One operational, one human resource oriented. And then finally, roster management, right? This is the one that HR people spend the most time in their lives, but I will always need to be able to say how many people work in the South right now with this job code because I need to go answer a question, or I need to run a report, or I need to do some kind of research. And so managing who is working for us today tends to matter a lot. And that's where Julie's point before about like changes to managers and changes to your marital status and where you live, and all of those things are all tracked in the roster management system typically. Cool. So I know we only have 9 minutes left. I know I kind of flew through that. If that was a lot, the video goes through this in a little bit more detail, and you can go back and rewatch this. I wanted to talk for a minute about the concept of orientation, right? Which is the determination of relative position of something or someone. In a few weeks, Dr. Ben is going to get deep into variables and kinds of data that we might want to say different things. I want to talk about this concept from the literal ones and zeros, rows and columns perspective. How is HR data oriented? And when I talk about oriented, I want you to think back to the data manipulation exercise that you did. You had one row per something in every table. In the roster, it was one row per employee. But in the job information tab, it was one row per job code. So they were two tables, but they were oriented to something different. And that's why their primary keys were different, right? Because they were oriented to different things. And HR data is the same. There's a large span of ways that HR data can be stored for the sake of what it's trying to quantify. And some examples are here. Completions of a course, surveys, promotion counts, terminations, rosters, candidates, classes, job openings. There's a ton of different ones. And I've been racking my brain for the last couple of months about how to talk about this with y'all. And I came up with a short mnemonic that might be helpful. It's of my own design, so you can't find it anywhere, but I think it's helpful. Tape. It's not an exciting word. I wanted like something like potato or something cool, but tape is what I came up with. Task, action, person, and event, right? Those are four major ways that HR data is oriented. So when data is oriented by row for an action to be taken by an employee, we call it a task, right? So you took a survey, there's now a big table, and one row in the survey is your response to that survey, right? Or you were told to take your data privacy class, and you went and you took that class, And now I can run a report, and one record in that report will be Chelsea's completion of the data privacy class. Now, sometimes an action is to be taken by the business. So we promoted Mariah last month, right? Or Ben left the company, right? And now there has to be a record for that action, right? That person was promoted, and I have a paper trail for when that action happened, who it happened to, and why that mattered. Now, sometimes that'll go back to a roster and influence something else, but there is a report you can run typically that is one record per action, right? An individual is very common in HR. Obviously, that's kind of a no-brainer. Rosters, candidates, one row per human, super common one. And then finally, an occurrence created by the business. This one was like the hardest one for me to think through. But things like classes, right? A learning management system might have hundreds or thousands of classes that are occurring, and there may be multiple occurrences of that class, and you need to go take the one that's in July in Memphis, and so that's the one you have to go take. Job openings is another good example of this. You might want to run how many jobs are open right now. And why would I call that an event? Well, the event is ultimately a hire that's connected to the rec, which is why I put it in that. But the idea is that these events are sort of in waiting to be completed, and they're created by the business to be completed by somebody at some point. So this isn't foolproof necessarily, but the point of me putting it out here for all of you is to think about, when I look at a table of data, the first thing I have to ask myself is, what do the rows mean? How is this data oriented? And how is that going to influence how I might analyze it? Is it a survey where I have one survey and then I have tons of rows that describe how the person answered the survey? Or do I have one record per person and all of the columns are attributes about that person, their level, their race, their location, etc.? So with 5 minutes left, we've gotten through all of our slides for the day. I'll take a breath. I know I ran through that really fast. I just wanted to make sure we got done on time. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? You are on
Definitely
mute, Whitney. I think you're talking.
Definitely a fast class, but we're going to be able to have access to this PowerPoint though, correct?
Absolutely. So,
And then
go ahead.
With the vignettes, is there can each of the examples that we have be inductive or deductive depending on how we interpret it? Or is there going to be, no, this one should be inductive, this one should be deductive?
No, that wasn't meant to be guidance that you need to do all of them. It was really just, I wanted to give you examples of each kind so that you could do it the way that that made sense to you. You just need one example per. All right. So we have before lab here, I put it back up on the screen. We've got some videos to watch, some reading to do. Keep working on your writing assignment, even though you've got a week extension on it. We're going to talk about it a little bit tomorrow. And Dr. Ben, you're taking over the show now. So do you want to close us out with anything?
No, only thing I was going to just give a little color commentary to the pieces, the video and the inductive and deductive. All of the reading in between now and tomorrow are very practical. These are the types of things that if you go out and you're reading HBR or you're reading something in the popular press, we want you to get some experience with consuming that sort of information and contrasting it with some of the things you've already learned. The one in the HBR I wanted to introduce, it's about the service profit chains back from 2008. This is one that you're going to read it and you're going to say, well, what does this have to do with the class? Well, what it has to do with the class is it is one of the most well-known examples of how employee in the popular press, not the academic press, but how the employee experience has a downstream impact on other outcomes like customer outcomes and business outcomes. And it's one that we're going to have some flavors of when we go into the final project and when we introduce that data. It's going to all have that little bit of the flavor. So it's fairly light reading. I think you'll actually find them quite interesting and useful. So anyway, just wanted to give a little color commentary as to what those reading assignments will be. And then tomorrow, what we'll be focusing on is really talking about organizational research methods. We've talked about logic. We've talked about some of the early points of digesting a problem statement and digging into the component pieces. Now we're going to transition into research methods. And we're going to spend a lot of time tomorrow, very collaborative. So be ready to participate in looking at vignettes. Really, we're going to introduce some unique vignettes that are not part of your assignment, but we're going to start breaking them down together. And there's going to be several cases where we'll break up into small groups, we'll digest it, and we'll just keep taking it a little bit further each week until we get into the actual statistics. And then we're going to get back into the numbers, for better or worse. So that's a little bit of a preview of what we have coming in tomorrow. So it should be a very collaborative session tomorrow. So with that, I'll just pause for any questions. Okay. Well, that's all we have for you tonight. Yes, sorry for the Eagles fans. Sorry to Chris. That's probably why he's gone. He's upset. It's okay with me. I don't care. But we'll send our condolences to Chris. And thank you all for being very active today. Thank you all for the feedback. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, keep going strong, guys. Don't forget Thursday dinner this upcoming Thursday night at Vanguard's main campus. I'm looking forward to it. It'll be really fun. If you have any questions, comments, concerns on Confessed Sins, you know how to get in touch with me. Love you guys. See you tomorrow
Bye,
night.
everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.